Hello everybody, this is Tyler here once again from the Character Workshop, and we are finally here at the final stretch, the fourth and unfortunately final series of Blackadder, simply titled Blackadder Goes Forth. I guess I always thought the Shrek movies were, pretty clever with their sequel titles, but Blackadder beat them to it. So the events of this series takes place during the events of World War I, which of course was between 1914 and 1917. And in this one, Blackadder is the captain of the British Army, and George, who was the prince during the events of Blackadder III, returns in this series, but as a lieutenant working alongside Blackadder, being pretty much his second in command. And with all the other series of Blackadder, the good old lovable and dumb Baldric is back, this time being a private. Now the interesting thing about Blackadder Goes Forth, it kind of like with Blackadder 2 and even the Blackadder to begin with, it went back to having a kind of a larger cast compared to the three main characters we had. So in Blackadder Goes Forth we had General Melchett, played by Stephen Fry, and if that name sounds familiar, Stephen Fry also played an earlier incarnation of Melchett in Blackadder 2, which, if you guys have seen that episode, basically Lord Melchett, during the events of Blackadder 2, was working alongside Queen Elizabeth I. So, General Melchett in Blackadder Goes Forth is basically just a descendant of him. And also, speaking of Blackadder veteran actors, Tim McGurney, the actor who played Lord Percy in the first two series of Blackadder, returns in Blackadder Goes Forth, but playing a completely different character this time. This time he's playing a character who pretty much works alongside General Melchett, of course being mistreated every now and then, simply by the name of Captain Darling. And of course every now and then throughout the series they often make a lot of jokes relating to his name. And with all the main character information out of the way, let us get into the 6 episodes that make up Blackadder Goes Forth. So we get into the first episode, simply titled Captain Cook, where the plot pretty much starts around where General Melchett, calls in Blackadder to his office, explaining that Field Marshal Haig's supreme tactical plan, where simply has men climb out of their trenches and walk slowly towards the enemy line, a plan which they've used 18 times, but with no success. He mentions to Blackadder that it's weakening their morale, so he thinks one of the best ways to increase their morale is to create a perfect portrait. So then Blackadder, Baldric, and George all went to work making their own pictures for the for what General Melchett said earlier. And Blackadder and Baldric ended up making pieces of art that weren't necessarily that good. However, George was able to do some really good art, so that gave Blackadder the idea to have George paint a picture of, a soldier supposed to look like him standing next to the body of a dead nun in a ruined French village, which the dead nun, of course, was Baldric. So General Melchett then looks at all three of the arts that the three main characters made. Of course, he liked George's the best, which Blackadder, of course, credited himself for the artwork, which did give Captain Darling a bit of a funny moment where he says, "First of all, Blackadder, I don't think this painting is yours. First of all, you're in it. And secondly, it's signed George," which Blackadder defends by saying, well, it's a self-portrait and this picture was dedicated to Prince George. Afterwards, Melchett reveals that the whole King and Country cover story, which he said earlier in the episode that they were planning on using, whoever did the best art for the cover of King and Country newspaper. And he said that instead of Paris, the chosen artist will be going into no man's land to draw the enemy positions. With the help of George and Baldric, Blackadder painted a fictional enemy defense image, which included a large number of elephants. Later on, both Captain Darling and Blackadder suggest to General Melchett that they should, that the push should be canceled, which Melchett in response said that, that's exactly what the enemy would expect from them. Melchett then orders it. To avoid this, Blackadder, George, and Baldric disguised themselves as Italian chefs, who were substituting themselves as Melchett's chef. After they served Baldric's terrible cooking to Melchett and Darling, three of them escape back to the trenches, where Blackadder mentions to Baldric that he asks him how he managed to get so much custard out of a small cat, which earlier in the episode it was revealed that Baldric apparently his cream custard is actually made out of cat's vomit. So then we get to episode 2, titled Corporal Punishment. And this episode starts off with Blackadder ignoring pretty much every message that he's been given about, going over the line. And eventually there was a pigeon that was also trying to give him the message too. And Blackadder proceeds to shoot the pigeon. However, later realizing that, shooting a carrier pigeon is basically an offense punishable by court-martial. In order to hide the evidence, Blackadder decides to, cook the pigeon for lunch. So General Melchett and Captain Darling then go to the trenches to ask Blackadder if he's received any messages. Blackadder claims that he didn't. They later found pigeon feathers, on the floor, which Baldric admitted that they were speckly colored. Melchett realized that Blackadder pretty much killed his favorite pigeon, which was apparently his pet pigeon too, named Speckled Jim, and tried to attack Blackadder. Captain Darling, of course, stopped him from doing it. Darling informs Blackadder that he's under arrest, and if found guilty, he will face execution by firing squad. So originally, in order to help him out, Blackadder sends a message to Sir Bob Massingbird, who is a brilliant lawyer that he believed would save his butt from the death penalty. However, the letters were mixed up thanks to Baldric, so Blackadder had no other choice but apparently had to have George be his lawyer for the court. And of course, it didn't end up going well for Blackadder, mostly because George's poor choices for witnesses, Darling being one of them, and Darling, of course, provided more evidence against Blackadder. Then Baldric, who Blackadder told to deny everything, and Baldric pretty much said no to every question George asked him, including his name. In the end, it ended up not going well for Blackadder, and of course Melchett, sentenced Blackadder to death by the firing squad without consulting the jury. So, of course, Blackadder had a variety of plans to try and get out of, the execution. One of them was George's mad uncle named Rupert's, who had just been made Minister of War and can hopefully get Blackadder out. Baldric and George, got into, an argument as to which person in the letter can help Blackadder, and eventually they know who it was, and rather than actually, doing the telegram, they actually, had a little drinking party and they got drunk, they passed out without actually sending a telegram. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost for Blackadder, there actually ended up being a telegram all along from Rupert, who heard about, Blackadder's execution and said that Melchett made a mistake, and he knew that Blackadder was a close friend of George, so Blackadder was pretty much saved by that. Of course, Blackadder read another one of George's telegrams and realizes that it wasn't from George or Baldric. And as revenge for the two of them, Blackadder volunteers that both of them would be going to a mission called Operation Certain Death, which was basically a mission to No Man's Land. We get to episode 3, which is called Major Star. The news spread around that, the Russian Revolution was happening, which, the Russians had pulled out of World War I because of it, which George was initially excited about until Blackadder revealed to him that the Russians were on their side of the war. Melchett then comes by, says that he asks Blackadder to organize a cabaret to boost the men's morale, which Blackadder, of course, was in for it, realizing that there would be a possible tour in there, which would allow Blackadder to leave the trenches. So Blackadder then, of course, puts on a show with the help of another captain by the name of Corporal Bob, who, of course, is actually a woman in disguise, which General Melchett was unaware of, but Blackadder obviously knew that right off the bat. But of course, Bob tells Blackadder not to reveal it. And interesting facts, this Bob person that's in this show was also in the first episode of Blackadder 2, at least an earlier ancestor of them. They put on a show, and Baldrick, of course, had a Charlie Chaplin impression, which was basically just a dead slug on Baldrick's mustache. And then George was actually dressed as a female by the name of the gorgeous Georgina, which Melchett saw the show and actually falls in love with Georgina and wants to take her to the ball. So then Melchett eventually explains to Blackadder that he's planning on marrying Georgina on that Saturday. As a bit of a way to get George out of this, Blackadder, lies to Melchett saying like, oh, Georgina died by frolicking herself into a cluster of landmines. Melchett then said, oh well, the show must go on, so Blackadder had to find somebody else to be a drag dancer in the show. Obviously, knowing that Bob is actually a girl, he decides to have Bob be the drag act of the show. Melchett was not a fan of when he saw it, as he somehow obviously knew that it was Bob in drag, which of course still not realizing that Bob is a girl, and stops any sort of plans on a tour happening, which also prevents Blackadder from leaving. Of course, after hearing that the Americans are now going to be going into World War I, he says that the morale will be boosted by endless showings of Charlie Chaplin films, which Blackadder himself claimed that he despised Charlie Chaplin. So then we get to episode 4, Private Plane. The episode starts with an ongoing artillery attack, which is disturbing. He gets awakened by the Flying Corpse Squadron, Commander Flashheart, and yes, if that name sounds familiar to you guys, this was pretty much the same Flashheart that was in the first episode of Blackadder 2. Of course, Flashheart offers George a place in the Flying Corps, who is initially uninterested. Blackadder was more agreeable when he learns that of the 20-minute squadron, which was named because new pilots can only spend 20 minutes in the air. So Blackadder eventually tries to join the Flying Corps, however realizing that Flashheart was the flight instructor. The actual reason for the name 20 minutes was because 20 minutes was the life expectancy of a new pilot, which Starling then, assures Blackadder that he'll be fine as long as he has a good navigator. Unfortunately for Blackadder, the navigator was Baldrick. As Blackadder and Baldrick were in the plane, they were eventually shot down by a German plane, and they were captured by a person by the name of Baron von Richthofen. I don't know. I don't know how to pronounce German last names. The reason for capturing them is because he wants to learn the subtleties of British humor, and he informs them on their fates, which he claims was worse than death, which was teaching home economics to young German girls in a coven outside of Heidelberg. Blackadder, of course, feigns sorrow, but is actually overjoyed by the news. George then tries to save Blackadder and Baldrick from their capture by asking help from both Darling and Melchett, which the both of them said that it would be pointless to help him out. Then eventually led to George recruiting Lord Flashheart to help out, who saves Baldrick and Blackadder, but Blackadder tries to get his way out of it by stalling them by saying that he splintered his pancreas, which Flashheart was not fooled by. They were stopped by the Baron, and he tries to confront Flashheart, comparing the nobility and majesty of their calling, and in response, Flashheart just simply shot him. After Blackadder was saved, he asks General Melchett to, asks for some time off to recuperate. Melchett agrees, stating that Blackadder's commanding officer would have to be mad to refuse. Blackadder reminds Melchett that he is the commanding officer and asks if he can have a week's leave to recuperate. Melchett says certainly not, refusing Blackadder's request. So then we get to episode 5, which is probably my favorite episode of Blackadder Goes Forth, General Hospital. And the opening of this episode was really hilarious. George and Baldrick were playing a game of I Spy, which Blackadder was annoyed by. And of course, Blackadder, did have some say in it. He was there was one scene where he was like, I spy with my little eye, something beginning with T, and then Baldrick said breakfast, and Blackadder was like, what? And then Baldrick said, well, my breakfast always starts with T, and then it, of course, a lot of, hilarious moments, follow afterwards. I mean, I would show it myself, but I'm worried that this episode would probably get, like, taken down, like, what happened with Blackadder 2 originally. Afterwards, George, you know, notices a bomb which landed on their trench, which, you know, eventually injures him and had them sent to the hospital. Meanwhile, around the events, Melchett and Captain Darling explain to Blackadder that there's a German spy in the hospital who's been leaking British battle plans back to the Kaiser. Melchett then gives Blackadder 3 weeks to, you know, realize who the spy at the hospital is. So when Blackadder and Baldrick arrive at the hospital to figure out who the German spy was, Blackadder ordered Baldrick to keep an eye on a guy by the name of Mr. Smith, who was an injured soldier who happened to have a thick German accent, who shares the same room with George. Of course, as the episode goes on, Blackadder, of course, develops a sexual relationship with the nurse of the place, named Nurse Mary Fletcher Brown. Which, of course, the amount of talking they did, of course, led Blackadder to realizing that she, in fact, was the German spy, and revealed this to Melchett. She was then taken away afterwards. Captain Darling tries to enter the room with Mr. Smith, who, when I was watching the episode, I thought he for sure was going to be the German spy, but eventually this was ended up not being true, as Melchett reveals to Darling, like, of course Smith is a spy. He's a British spy who happened to have, like, a really good German accent, which, of course, he developed when he was in Germany, so Blackadder's, you know, suspicion of who the German spy was actually ended up being true. The episode then ends with George actually entering the room and reveals himself as the leak when he remarks that a relative that he's been writing to is in fact Uncle Herman, who was in Munich, meaning that he apparently had a German uncle. Darling, you know, smugly confronts Blackadder about this, and the two of them race out of the room to inform Melchett about it. And then we get to the final episode, Goodbye. And this episode depicts, of course, the main character's final hours before the major British offensive on the Western Front of World War I. And upon hearing this news, Blackadder, of course, tries to, you know, escape the push by attempting to make it seem like that he's gone mad by, of course, wearing, like, some sort of cloth on his head and having, like, you know, 2 pencils up his nose. General Melchett, of course, you know, was not convinced, saying to Blackadder that, of course, you know, he's, you know, dealt with, like, several hundreds of, like, soldiers that have tried the same thing. And from what I've heard, he also shot a couple of them. Throughout the process of the episode, Blackadder, Baldrick, and George, you know, have, you know, several attempts to try and escape the push. George did say, you know, he was, you know, pretty much looking forward to it, in a way. Of course, Baldrick, you know, made a whole speech, you know, about, like, why couldn't they just stop doing the war and whatnot. As one final attempt to try and get out, Blackadder tries to contact Field Marshal Haig, played by Jeffrey Palmer. Haig then, you know, suggested, you know, Blackadder, the only way to get him out was to, you know, do the same exact tactic that Blackadder tried to attempt on Melchett, which pretty much left Blackadder in, like, you know, a situation where he can't back out of it. Melchett then said to Captain Darling that he'll be promoted to being in front of the line, so Darling will have to, you know, be a part of the push as well, much to Darling's, you know, dismay. So when dawn finally reached, all 4 of the characters, Blackadder, Baldrick, George, and Darling, were all up there, you know, in the trenches, getting ready to finally go up there and try to make their final push. It led to the ending of the series, where the main characters were assumed to have died by machine gun fire. And the actual ending of the episode didn't really have, like, any credits going on. It just, you know, had a field of poppies, you know, in place of where the trench was. I think I can arguably say, out of all the endings of all the Blackadder series, this one was probably by far the darkest. Especially, you know, Blackadder and, you know, some of the other characters themselves not wanting to be a part of it, but they had no other choice, and in the end they apparently all ended up dying. Yeah, quite a dark turn of events, you know, from what was pretty much a hilarious series, you know, from, you know, front to back. yeah, with that being said, that is about the end of Blackadder Goes Forth. Pretty good series, as all the Blackadder series has been. I probably might say, I don't know, like this one and Blackadder the Third are pretty tough as to which one I prefer. But I think I might say, you know, I think as, like, you know, Blackadder sort of progressed, I think, like, each series got better and better, and I think I can arguably say Goes Forth is probably my favorites. I definitely enjoyed Blackadder Goes Forth, and if you guys have, you know, seen, you know, the first 3 series of Blackadder, I'm sure you'll get a kick out of Blackadder Goes Forth. And as I mentioned before, this was the final series of Blackadder, but thankfully it wasn't the end of Blackadder as a whole. There have been, like, several other projects related to Blackadder that have come out, like, you know, during and also after the series ended. For example, the short film Blackadder Back and Forth, which was made in honor of the new millennium. And also Blackadder the Cavalier Years, I believe, which is, I haven't covered yet, but I'll definitely cover it at some point on the series. I think with that being said, that is about it for this episode of Vacation from England. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to give it a like, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more episodes of Vacation from England, or just mediocre plush content in general. Leave a comment down below letting me know what you think. That is about it. This is Tyler from the Character Workshop, signing out. Next time, I'm going to be covering the most recent TV series from an entire franchise that's been going on for pretty much 50 years at this point. And this show in particular was my introduction to this so-called franchise, and I'm sure you guys probably know which franchise and show I'm talking about. Maybe.